got to stop, and it has to stop now. And this person will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Donald Trump is using the presidency of the United States to make himself richer.
It's absurd for anyone to insinuate that this president is profiting off of the presidency.
This will be the greatest increase in the debt ceiling ever, and GOP owns this now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, 2 Israeli embassy staffers gunned down as they left the Jewish Museum in Washington Wednesday evening. The FBI now investigating. The suspect, a 30-year-old man from Chicago, according to witnesses, yelled, "Free Palestine," while being arrested. He just made his first appearance in court late this afternoon. The victims have been identified as friends and colleagues who were just days away from becoming engaged.
But our Jewish community must feel safe. What we saw last night was disgusting. The hate has got to stop, and it has to stop now. And this person will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Guess who is coming to dinner? President Trump hosts a private dinner tonight here in the D.C. area for buyers of his meme coin. The self-declared top holder of Trump's coin is a Chinese billionaire, the president's latest money-making venture, and why it's raising significant ethical questions. The House delivers President Trump a narrow and significant win on his budget bill. This after an overnight marathon legislative session there on the House floor. The bill was approved by the narrowest of margins, 215 to 214. It does have a long way to go, but this was a significant victory for the White House and House Republicans. The next stop, of course, the Senate, where Republicans there have their own plans. Stay tuned. The bill in its current form increases military spending. It orders cuts to Medicaid and food stamps that will likely make the poorest Americans poorer. And it's projected to add trillions to the deficit. I want to start tonight with CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd, Department of Justice correspondent Scott McFarland. Scott, tell us about the victims and what we know about the actual crime itself.
Let's start with the crime, because a press conference that we were watching earlier is revealing a few things. There are 5 felony charges now filed against Elias Rodriguez, including the rarely charged murder of foreign officials. A couple of these charges could lead to a death penalty case, and you just heard the U.S. attorney say she is likely to add more charges when this goes to a grand jury. So it doesn't stop here, it kind of starts here. This happened after 9 p.m. last night. It's worth underscoring the where. Not only was it outside the Capitol Jewish Museum, where an event was being held, a business event, the location of which was not publicized, but it happened about 15, 20 feet from the FBI's Washington, D.C. field office, a building that is presumably blanketed with cameras and around which there are at least a couple marked officers, FBI police. And it's also down the street from the D.C. police headquarters, the U.S. Department of Justice headquarters, the courthouse where this proceeding is underway right now. And if you crane your neck, you can see the U.S. Capitol. There may have been an expectation of safety in that area that was confounded.
Sam, how do you evaluate what transpired last night and describe for the audience the level of generalized threat that Israeli and Jewish facilities are experiencing, not just here, but worldwide?
Well, anti-Semitism has persisted since the Jewish people came into existence, and anti-Israel violence has existed since the creation of the State of Israel. What changed after October 7th, Hamas's terrorist attack against Israel, and then Israel's subsequent invasion of Gaza, was that bad actors of all kinds had just another motivating factor to unleash violence against Jews, against Israelis, and against people believed to be associated with the State of Israel. We saw a dramatic increase in threats against the Jewish community and individuals and entities associated with the State of Israel after October 7th. Federal, state, and local officials tried to enhance physical security resources, intelligence collection, and more. But as Scott just said, despite being in our nation's capital with such a significant law enforcement presence, a lone wolf actor was able to perpetuate a brutal crime. And Major, that is because a lone wolf actor is a counterterrorism official's worst nightmare. They operate alone, they're hard to detect, and even meters from an FBI office building, it's virtually impossible to understand that they're about to conduct an attack and to prevent it from happening.
And Scott, it's my impression that the assailant, now charged, didn't do very much to conceal himself after the fact.
He did the opposite. According to the charging documents just released and reviewed by CBS News, he proclaimed himself the shooter when police were questioning him, or at least near him, in fact, unsolicited. He said he did it for Gaza. He did it for the Palestinians. That notwithstanding, you're talking about an area that is saturated by cameras, by images, and no doubt there's a lot of those. There was an FBI search of his apartment in Chicago. The 31-year-old had an apartment there. He worked for a medical association. We just learned from the news conference that he was here for a conference, which is common in Washington, D.C. this time of year, that he was here for business, and somehow, some way, ended up outside this museum as people were coming and going.
And Sam, Scott indicated a moment ago that this event was not publicized. Would it be fair to assume, and I underscore the word assume, which is always dangerous in these situations, but the assailant, now charged, was just looking for an opportunity and opportunistically came upon something in which two victims were found, maybe accidentally, maybe without his foreknowledge?
It's entirely possible, and that's what the investigation will unveil. We heard during the press conference officials asking for help from the public. This individual had a firearm on his person. I'm not certain when he got access to that firearm and whether he was planning some kind of attack against a Jewish institution, an Israeli embassy or Israeli ambassador's residence prior to coming, and that's what the FBI will be trying to figure out. Right now, however, authorities are trying to affirm that there's no ongoing threat to the public. We've been told that there is none, and importantly, that this doesn't inspire copycat attacks. When I used to run responses to incidents like this, we knew that these individuals' acts would be glorified online and elsewhere. And right now, authorities want to make sure that others aren't inspired to act in a similar way to the assailant based upon the media coverage of this incident and the motivating factors behind it.
Because that has happened in other instances of mass violence committed against Jewish people. Tree of Life,
Yes.
San Diego, other places. Immediately thereafter, there was amplification and, in some quarters, dark quarters of the web, celebration of these acts of wanton violence.
Indeed, and that's why the FBI, DHS, and others, consistent with their authorities, will be monitoring online chat rooms, social media accounts to see if there's any concerning language or behavior, any leads that develop related to any copycat attacks, while concurrently doing everything possible to enhance the security posture at Jewish institutions and at entities perceived to be or actually associated with the state of Israel. So it's the intel piece and the law enforcement posture.
And Scott, any sense that we have, and I know this is developing, as so many things are, any new security protocols downtown, this area generally?
Washington, D.C. and the suburbs both have ratcheted up security of locations where people of Jewish faith will be. I suspect other cities, other communities will do the same. Let me just take this opportunity to reference the victims. Yaron Lashinsky had an engagement ring he was about to give to the other victim, his girlfriend, Sarah Milgram. According to the Israeli foreign minister, he was going to give it to her next week during a visit to the Holy Land. Friends describe them both as young peacemakers, people who were working at the embassy to try to stop the type of violence that killed them last night. It's a painful type of irony.
Story that is draped in tragedy on so many different levels. Scott MacFarlane, Sam Vinograd, thank you. We're head to the White House now, where we find our Nancy Cordes. Nancy, President Trump on social media weighed in on all this?
He did. In fact, he posted about it shortly after the shooting took place, Major, saying that anti-Semitic violence has to end. He expressed his condolences to the families of the victims. And we anticipated that perhaps he might have something to say today here at the White House. He did not, but his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, did tell reporters today that the individual who has been arrested will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Nancy, talking about this meme coin, this crypto dinner tonight, 220 invited guests at the President's Golf Club here in Northern Virginia. What do we know about the guest list? What do we hear from those who look at this somewhat aghast?
Here's what we know about the guest list, Major. We know that in order to get on it, people had to be among the top purchasers of the Trump coin. We are talking about millions, if not tens of millions of dollars spent on the coin that was created by the president and his family and other backers just a few days before he took office for his second term. The top 220 buyers are invited tonight. There was even a leaderboard that was posted so that if buyers wanted to get into this dinner and they weren't quite on the list, they could buy a little bit more. What we don't know, Major, is the identity of most of these individuals, because you are allowed to purchase these kinds of meme tokens or cryptocurrency anonymously. There have been analysts who have looked at the information that is available and concluded that a lot of the people who are on this list appear to be foreign buyers. So these are not necessarily U.S. citizens. They may be foreign-born living here in the U.S., or perhaps they don't live in the U.S. We would like to know more, but their identities are shielded. And when we asked the White House today if they would be providing a list of attendees, they said they would not be, because this is something that the president is doing on his personal time as part of his personal business.
Nancy, some view this as a possible pathway to persuasion, meaning you invest, you buy the Trump meme coin, and you have access that others otherwise might not. Possible pathway to persuasion is one way of phrasing it. Elizabeth Warren, Democratic Senator from Massachusetts, phrased it differently. Let's listen.
Donald Trump's dinner is an orgy of corruption. Donald Trump is using the presidency of the United States to make himself richer through crypto. And he's doing it right out there in plain sight.
Nancy, White House reaction to that line of criticism?
Yes, the White House press secretary was asked about this today. I asked her about it. Others asked her about it. The fact that unlike a campaign donation, for example, from a wealthy individual or a business that wants to curry favor with a particular politician, perhaps wants to get in the room with that politician, in this case, these are purchases that are directly benefiting the president and his family members, going directly into their pockets. The White House press secretary insisted that this is a president who was a successful businessman before he ever took office, and that he is always scrupulous about paying attention to conflict of interest laws. But here, take a listen to her in her own words.
The American public believe it's absurd for anyone to insinuate that this president is profiting off of the presidency. This president was incredibly successful before giving it all up to serve our country publicly. And not only has he lost wealth, but he also almost lost his life.
What we do know, Major, is that so far since this coin was created, the family has made about $300 million from transaction fees alone.
Nancy Cordes, North Line of the White House. Thanks so much. Nicole Killian joins me now from Capitol Hill. Nicole, it's been a long week for all legislators in the House, Republican and Democrat, concluding with a vote today. A very big, significant victory for House Speaker Mike Johnson, who said all along this would stay on course. It would take some negotiating, but those negotiations would ultimately produce a result. He was vindicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also that's why you heard the president really lavish on a lot of praise to the speaker when he was here on Capitol Hill earlier this week, because quite frankly, the speaker has been meeting with the president for many, many months now. In fact, well before he took office, to strategize about this big, beautiful package and trying to get it done. So I think that's why the speaker was pretty confident that ultimately he would meet the mark, but certainly a legislative victory for him in terms of getting all members of his conference, with the exception of one or two on board.
And Nicole, you used big, beautiful bill. That was for a long time a marketing slogan. It is no more. To be accurate in describing what this bill is legislatively called, you and I are obligated now to call it what it is legislatively called, which is?
The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBB to be precise. But look, hey, it sticks in the mind, right? But look, this encompasses the president's legislative priorities. So yes, in his view, it is big and it is beautiful because this not only funds his agenda with respect to defense and energy, but also border security. It fully funds his border wall, for instance. It extends his 2017 tax cuts, which is something that Republicans had really been pushing for, increases the child tax credit, even has Trump savings accounts for newborns as part of this package, as well as making good on some of his campaign proposals like no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. But it does come with a pretty steep price, as we've been reporting, in terms of upwards of $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion in cuts, much of that coming from Medicaid, also SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, which encompasses food stamps. So that is a big concern, of course, to Democrats, which is why they unanimously oppose this package, because they argue that this big, beautiful bill is actually a big, ugly bill that will really harm millions of Americans if it becomes law.
And Nicole, I want to play for you sound from Speaker Johnson talking about how difficult it was to put this compromise together among House Republicans, and why that difficulty should be on the minds of Senate Republicans as they consider their response to this bill. Let's listen.
We have a very delicate equilibrium that we reached on here. A lot of work went into this to find exactly the right balance. And you all saw how perilous that was over the last week as it developed. And I encourage our Senate colleagues to think of this as a one-team effort, as we have, and to modify this as little as possible.
On that, we would probably say good luck, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, that's right. But look, he continues to insist that he has been working in lockstep with the Senate, and many GOP leadership aides have said as much. I mean, Leader Thune, for his part, certainly doesn't want to stand in the way and is determined to try to get this package over the finish line as well. His deadline is to try to do this by July 4th, if at all possible. But look, we have heard from some Republican senators who have their own views about this package, see this more of a starting point for the Senate rather than an end point. You have some senators like Ron Johnson want to break apart this package. Others like Rand Paul, who are concerned about, the debt and what this would add to the deficit. So from that standpoint, Leader Thune now has the Herculean task of trying to keep his members on board to try to push through this package.
A long week for lawmakers and a long week for those dedicated to watching the lawmakers. That includes our outstanding Nicole Killian. Nicole, as always, thank you so much.
You bet.
There's a new book out there. It's selling quite well. It describes a, quote, cover-up of President Biden's mental and physical decline. I'll speak with the co-author of that new book here on America Decides next.
Dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
It was answers like that during then President Biden's debate with now President Trump that allowed Democratic confidence in him to first atrophy, then collapse, forcing him ultimately out of the presidential race, as we all remember. And a new book finds Biden's inner circle tried very hard and in many ways to hide, shield, and obfuscate what they recall, and many Democrats now are willing to talk about, his mental and physical decline. I spoke with the co-author of that book. It's called Original Sin, Alex Thompson, earlier today. What is the sin and what makes it the first one, or the original sin?
Well, this title actually came about as Democrats were wondering how they lost. So from the Democratic perspective, the sin was Donald Trump winning. And so as Democrats, right after the election, we started this book on November 6th, as Democrats were sort of looking at the wreckage and wondering, how did this go wrong? A few people kept saying, going back and said, the original sin of this election, the most consequential moment, the biggest reason we lost. There are other things, Joe Rogan, not going on Joe Rogan, and Kamala Harris not being able to do media interviews. Yes, that's all bad. But the original sin was Joe Biden deciding to run for re-election.
How much of that openness to discuss this original sin that cropped up suddenly in the smoldering ruin of the election outcome struck you as a reporter as CYA?
I mean, I think it was both CYA and also relief. and feeling that they could finally say it. Because I think there was an element of fear that had basically rendered them all mute throughout the election. I mean, it was clear that to so many Democrats, I think we detail many instances of Democrats, both inside the administration and on Capitol Hill, that saw Joe Biden in 2023 and 2024 especially, and thought to themselves, he's not up to this. And they didn't say anything. And so I think some people were doing this with pangs of regret. I think also some people were like, the election's not our fault. Like, it's all Joe Biden's fault. And I think what we try to do in this book is that we don't try to make it, it's all Joe Biden's fault. It's that Joe Biden decided to run for re-election, and then the entire Democratic Party, including people that knew better, that knew he was, if not even up to running a re-election campaign, certainly knew that he was not up to being president for 4 more years, did not say anything out of fear, and fear both of their own political careers, but also fear that doing so would only hurt Biden, make him dig in deeper, and then help Donald Trump.
In 2017, there was a book that a lot of Americans saw, many read, called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. A bunch of psychiatrists got together and diagnosed what they described as dangerous psychological tendencies of Donald Trump, writing that it was their duty to warn the country. And one of the things they pointed out was what they detected was a kind of malignant narcissism. Should there have been, did there needed to have been a book with the title The Dangerous Case of Joe Biden?
Well, first of all, that book, I don't necessarily think had the effect the authors intended, given that. So I don't know if a book would have.
But evaluating Joe Biden as not just a typically narcissistic politician, but one driven by narcissism to a point of blindness, so far that his narcissism began to infect the Democratic Party and essentially, as you and Jake Tapper report in this book, silenced so many people who otherwise knew better.
It's so interesting because Democrats love to mock Republicans for saying something different about Donald Trump in quiet, in private, and saying something different publicly, and then this sort of dear leader stuff. But if you read this book, they were doing the exact same thing.
It is a mirror image of that.
Yes, absolutely.
They are the ones who are now being mocked, that history is likely to mock.
I think so, and the way that they also treated those, similarly, you remember in 2017, 2018, some of those congressional Republicans that stuck their necks out, people like Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and then they were just completely decapitated by their own party. Look at what happened to Dean Phillips. Dean Phillips spoke out, and he is no longer in Congress.
Right. Is there, for you and Jake, looking at the reporting on this, do you think that there was a moment when this rickety scaffolding actually began to collapse separate from the debate performance?
Yes.
Or was, okay, please.
Fall of 2023, I think, is when, obviously we sort of say like good Biden and old Biden, or good Biden and or functioning Biden and non-functioning Biden. I mean, back in 2019, 2020, I mean, you covered that primary too. Like, there were moments that were like, that's a little odd.
Right.
But for the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, he was a little slower, but, was definitely like with it. I think, the fall of 2023, I would say a few different factors. One is his son Hunter's plea deal unravels. A special counsel is appointed by Joe Biden's own attorney general to investigate his son and his son's business dealings that involve all sorts of the family. You have October 7th, and also aging is unpredictable. And by all accounts, from the more than 200 people that we talked to, and we almost exclusively interviewed Democrats because we wanted sort of this internal reckoning that the party was going through. We didn't, yes, Kevin McCarthy has something to say, other members, Republican members, but we wanted to get the internal Democrats, and Democrats that saw him at that time noticed a precipitous decline, that basically the ratio of functioning to non-functioning Biden not only changed significantly, but non-functioning Biden became much worse and would come out in unpredictable ways. And that's when you start seeing the inner Praetorian Guard, or Royal Palace Guard, as Chuck Schumer refer to them, really start shielding him more and more because they can't predict. And so they're basically like white knuckling it until the debate, their luck runs out.
And stay with us for more of my conversation with Alex next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. I've been speaking with co-author of the new book, Original Sin. His name is Alex Thompson, about his reporting on former President Biden's decline. Here's more of that conversation. There's so much fascinating reporting in here about the elaborate and increasingly elaborate mechanisms that this Praetorian Guard, this Politburo, whatever the phraseology used by either supporters or critics or those who really didn't have a dog in the fight but saw this clique of people around President Biden, the things that they went through and then orders they gave to try to minimize the visibility and the accumulated political harm of his decline.
Well, and it's so interesting that we can use so many different phrases, Praetorian Guard, Royal Palace Guard, and that's because this sort of system has existed in so many power centers all across history, all across cultures. And I think sometimes there's this feeling like, well, America, we're different. But like sometimes that sort of thing happens here. And what you saw over the course of October 2023, for example, this is more of a physical thing than a mental thing, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. They were terrified that he was going to have another fall because they were told that another fall would mean potentially a wheelchair, and that also he might even need a wheelchair in a second term anyway because his spine was degenerating. And so, they insisted on handrails every single place. They wanted to make the stairs shorter, not just on Air Force One, but everywhere. They wanted to limit the distance he had to walk any single time. They gave him new shoes, obviously. Other little things, because his energy became increasingly limited, public events in the early mornings or late at night, or even just in the early evening, those were definitely pushed off. When he would film like campaign commercials, and people on the campaign said this man could not speak. The amount of hours they had to put in order to make a digital video seemed to make sense. Were just astronomical. And many campaigns need 2 cameras in order to deal with what they're called jump cuts. Right. But they needed so many of them to make anything presentable. At one point, the campaign even does a fake town hall, stage town hall, closed to press, so they can do a campaign commercial. And this isn't that unusual. Other campaigns have done this, but usually those campaigns are actually having candidates that are doing town halls. Joe Biden was not doing town halls. So they do this stage town hall in Delaware with supporters. They film the whole thing, and then the campaign determines that footage is unusable because he was still struggling to communicate.
How much of this story, Alex, is driven by the mythology of Joe Biden? Meaning, I was always given short odds by Democratic insiders, always underestimated. I beat Trump. I can only beat Trump. That's my myth. That's what I believe. And everyone has to ride along with me.
Yeah, I mean, he has been the mythology of Joe Biden.
And some of those things are true. I'm not suggesting they aren't.
Look at all the things Joe Biden has overcome in his life. I mean, even before the recent presidency, obviously you have the accident. You have the fact that he lost in 1988, then overcame 2 brain aneurysms. He got his butt kicked in the 2008 primary, then became vice president. Then and then he won the 2020 Democratic primary. Won the the thing is that, to your point, he can recite chapter and verse every single time that people counted him out, and he beat them. It is if it's a Biden mythology, or as we call in the book, that became a theology. The first commandment is Joe Biden always comes back. And the reason why we frame this book as a tragedy is because this, probably his signature virtue, which is the never giving up, eventually became a tragic flaw. And the way that the people around Joe Biden describe his decision to run for a second term, what's so striking about it is how little of a process there was, and that it's a given. He deserves it. All presidents get 2 terms. And I think there was, that chip on the shoulder had just sort of like consumed him in some ways.
Last question. Do you have any sense as to whether or not, as Democrats advance toward 2028, where were you on Joe Biden? What is your example of public cleansing and self-accountability for what you did or didn't do will be akin to the Iraq war vote was in 2008?
It's interesting you ask, because several Democrats have used that analogy, right? And they feel that if Hillary Clinton had voted a different way, she probably is president in 2008. And then, but that seminal where were you at this moment, eventually allowed for a new person to come out of nowhere. In that case, it was Barack Obama. I don't know. I mean, how much does this really affect the politics 3 years from now? You don't know. I think some of it depends on how the Trump presidency goes, because if you're in 2027 and you and the Democratic Party is basically like, how did we let this happen mode, I think this could be a really key issue.
President Trump says he wants the Senate to pass the budget bill, quote, as soon as possible. We will bring in our reporter panel next to decide or assess how likely that's going to be, right here on America Decides.
We look forward to the Senate's timely consideration of this once-in-a-generation legislation. We stand ready to continue our work together to deliver on the one big, beautiful bill, as President Trump named it himself.
Look, folks, a win is a win, and that's a big win for Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, celebrating justifiably. I mean, from his political point of view, this legislation was hard to put together, and it passed. Doesn't matter if it passed by just one vote. It passed. That's all that matters in the House of Representatives, because you've got to advance this. It was a no-fail proposition for the House Speaker, and he did not fail. That's enough out of me. Let's turn to our reporter panel. Leanne Caldwell, Chief Washington Correspondent for Puck News, and I am a happy subscriber. Julie Grace Bufke, Capitol Hill reporter for 24 Site News. So, Leanne, take it away. Put into context what happened this week, why it matters to Mike Johnson, and why his relationship with Trump solidified this hard-fought victory.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge week for Mike Johnson. Everyone was skeptical that he would not only be able to get it done, but get it done on his self-imposed timeline of before Memorial Day.
Which was an invention.
It was totally frivolous and unnecessary, but he did it, and he got a lot of criticism for creating that deadline. But he knew that you had to vote. The sooner you voted, the easier it is to pass. The longer it takes, the more difficult it gets. But the number one strategic decision that Mike Johnson made, which has benefited him over and over again in these 120 days of President Trump's presidency, is that Mike Johnson has been able to be successful over and over again because he has been able to rely so closely on Trump to help move members and get these difficult things over the finish line. And we saw it in kind of like a masterful performance this week, where Donald Trump was on the Hill on Tuesday. He brought in the hardliners to the White House yesterday. Hours later, this thing passed.
Julie Grace, talk about the drama.
Well, because definitely there were some contentious meetings, and even people within Mike Johnson's orbit and leadership world were doubting within the past 48 hours whether this would get over the finish line. And there was a lot of arm twisting up until kind of the final minute there. And I know Freedom Caucus, things got really heated in some of those closed-door meetings between Andy Harris and President Trump, who was kind of calling him an idiot for not voting for the bill. So he ultimately ended up voting present. And we've heard a lot of, I mean, he managed to flip Chip Roy, who was one of the most adamant people on that bill, saying there needs to be a lot more work done in the Senate, which, I mean, he may have lost a little of his own leverage there, but it sounds like a lot of people that are kind of in the same vein of him are pushing for the same things over in the upper chamber.
And Julie Grace, President Trump rolled out the word betrayal and rolled out the word primary. Both have meaning in the Trump world.
Absolutely. And Warren Davidson and Thomas Massie, I mean, he's threatened that with Thomas Massie before, who might have enough of his own brand to be able to weather that. It might be
Kentucky,
a bigger issue for Warren Davidson. And we'll see, I mean, what the Senate sends back and whether they get on board. But it's, yeah, I mean, I think that's something that is definitely a concern for people in those orbits.
And Leanne, talk about the Senate and the issues that are going to divide Republicans there and possibly put them into a contentious relationship. Let's just say, for a matter of purposes, folks, that the Senate and the House are always sort of contentious, generally. And that's not an ideological thing. That's just an institutional thing.
Yeah.
But Republicans might find themselves at odds over a couple of three big issues.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing that is going to divide the House and the Senate is this issue of the state and local tax deduction. Of course, to remind our viewers that that is the federal tax relief that you get if you are highly taxed in a high tax state for state and local taxes. So the House Salt Blue State Republicans fought tremendously to ensure that a $10,000 deduction cap got increased, quadrupled. There are no blue state Republicans in the Senate who care about this. This is the last thing that they want in this bill. So that is going to be and that is, having this deduction in there is why Mike Johnson can get it through.
One, it's costly, and two, they would say it incentivizes high taxes in high-tax blue states.
Yeah, absolutely. And they say the rest of the country is paying to subsidize these few high-tax blue states. So that's going to divide the House and the Senate, and that's going to be a huge issue. But also the Senate, they have different ideas about Medicaid. They actually want more cuts to Medicaid in some instances. They want more savings in Medicaid, I should say. We'll see how that plays out. And even in the Inflation Reduction Act, these are these renewable energy tax credits. They're a little bit more skeptical of getting rid of many of those tax credits. And so Medicaid's going to be an issue, could divide the Senate Republicans. The Inflation Reduction Act can divide Republicans.
And Julie Grace, how do you assess the Senate schedule and some of these fault lines that Leanne has just outlined?
But it's interesting to Leanne's point. I mean, these New Yorkers, they're already kind of trying to lobby over on the Senate side to kind of get that over the finish line.
New York, New Jersey, California, those are the big three.
Yeah, so
throw Illinois in there, but only a couple of those.
I've spoken to a lot of Republicans that kind of speculated they were fighting so hard in the House that when they lower it, that they'd still be able to kind of get a win, knowing that they'd have to get it back through the House. We'll see if they were successful kind of in that endeavor there. But, I mean, the Medicaid's going to be a huge thing. I know John Thune's already whipping the House version to kind of take the temperature of where things are and what they're going to need to change.
Interestingly, Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, Democrats have said has more critical and on-point talking criticisms of those Medicaid reductions in the House bill than Senate Democrats do.
He's been very adamant about it, and I mean,
he's going to be someone to watch.
Absolutely, and I mean, they're working with slim margins over there, so it's going to be a fight. They're going to be walking a tightrope and trying to get all of them on board. And I think July 4th, it's going to be. I mean, the Memorial Day deadline seemed to kind of out of reach, so we'll see if John Thune can pull it off. So, a lot to watch.
Leanne, this feels to me like something that will be resolved before the August break, not the July 4th.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, maybe the Senate can pass something before July 4th, but then it has to go back to the House. They have to, of course, pass the same bill. So, yeah, I think August is the more official timeline, especially since, remember, they have that debt limit they have to address, and that deadline's in August.
Leanne Caldwell, Julie Grace Bufke, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Today, the Trump administration escalated its feud with Harvard, barring the university from enrolling international students, a very big deal. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem informed the college that she terminated their Student at Exchange Visitor Program certification. According to the university, 27% of the student body made up of international students. Harvard responded, calling the move, quote, unlawful. The world's two biggest economies, you probably heard something about this, well, they're feuding over trade. Yeah, China and the United States. What China is saying about how it thinks this trade war with the United States can and should end. Perspective on that next here on America Decides. Welcome back. China says trade talks with the United States, well, they're important, but other countries need to get involved to reach a comprehensive solution. The Chinese delegation, the World Trade Organization, said in a statement today, and I'm quoting, "We need to find the way out," unquote. Beijing and the Trump administration agreed to a 90-day semi-truce that lowered tariffs between the two countries earlier, lowered them from what were essentially embargo-level tariff rates. But that doesn't mean that they're effectively low. More on that with our guest, Andrew Polk. He joins me now. He's a partner at Trivium China, a Beijing-based research firm. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. It's interesting to me that when the 90-day cooling-off period was announced, the United States, through the Trump administration, kept what is effectively a 31% tariff rate on China. And the equity markets were like, yay, that's normal. Andrew, remind my audience, that's not normal.
That's not normal at all, and I like the way you put it. This is a semi-truce. It's not a full truce. It's not an agreement. It's a temporary de-escalation. And not only are tariffs still at 30% from the U.S. onto China, that's just the increase so far this year. We had earlier tariffs also put on. So the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods into the U.S. is actually closer to 50%.
And have consumers begun to feel that yet?
They have not. So they've felt the pain from, the first Trump administration tariffs. We've already seen that kind of go through. We've seen inflation under the Biden administration. That partly played into that. But we really have not seen these prices filter into, the prices at retail stores because retail stores had inventories of all these goods, and we have not seen the drawdown of those inventories, and so the pain is not yet.
Give my audience a perspective on how the Chinese view all this. And President Trump wants to do all this with President Xi. Chinese don't approach it that way.
That's right. I mean, the Chinese don't want this trade war. They want to de-escalate. But part of the reason that it took them so long to come to the table is, like many other countries, they are unclear exactly what the ask is from the White House. Does Donald Trump want them to do something on fentanyl precursors? Does he want them to lower the trade surplus? Does he want them to invest more in the U.S.? Does he want them to take a more active role in Russia-Ukraine negotiations? So
they don't know.
They don't know, and so they don't want to be negotiating against themselves ahead of actual talks with the White House. So they've been very slow to come to the table. And also, as we know, Donald Trump wants to do the negotiations directly with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping does not want to put himself in that situation. They saw what happened in the Oval Office with the meeting with Vladimir Zelensky. The Chinese side is not going to put Xi Jinping in a place to be embarrassed by that, trying to negotiate, let alone in public, but even leader-to-leader level before some of this is worked out at the lower working level.
And Andrew, something is interesting is happening in the region. As this goes on, unresolved, China's traveling around saying, we want to be a better trade partner, right?
That's right.
Looking out for its economic interests to try to fill this vacuum.
They're doing that to fill the vacuum. They're doing that partially to sort of as a rhetorical device to say the U.S. is, unreliable. We're the reliable partner here. Come to our side, cozy up to us to the extent you can. But they also are trying to offset some of the pain of the tariffs from the U.S. by sending more of their goods to other Asian countries, to Europe. And so a lot of that is basically trade diplomacy. The problem for China becomes if all the goods that were going to go to the U.S. start to deluge other markets, then those other trading partners may not buy into that. We're the stable trading partner because all of a sudden they're seeing an influx of Chinese goods.
And look, there are and have been significant issues with Chinese theft of American intellectual property. The ownership requirements, strenuous. American companies would argue onerous. Ownership requirements to operate in China. Currency manipulation. These are real issues that lots of American administrations, Democratic and Republican, have tried to resolve with China. And they keep pushing us back, basically fronting us off.
That's right. And there's definitely a perspective out there that says, we didn't start the trade war with China. The trade war with China was started a long time ago by all these actions that they've taken. And we're just now responding. In many people's eyes, 10 years, 20 years too late. That's obviously not how the Chinese view it. I think, ironically, though, the overarching goal of American administrations for U.S. businesses was to push back against the Chinese to get more access in China for American businesses. And that's clearly not what the Trump administration wants, which brings you back to the point of what actually is the goal of the tariffs and how can China find a way to negotiate towards that goal with the Trump administration.
One last thing before I let you go. For China and every other trading partner, they're trying to figure out, are these tariffs permanent or a negotiating mechanism? And nobody can quite figure that out. Right?
That's right. I think for the Chinese, they, having been through a trade war with the U.S. before, were one of the few countries that saw all this coming, right? They've seen this playbook and have prepared. But their view is, at least whatever happens with the tariffs, the relationship between the U.S. and China is going to, get worse and worse over time. So they don't think this is a short-term development at all.
Andrew Pope, great to have you at the desk. I appreciate it very much. That does it for me today. I'll be back with the final edition, the very last edition of American Science tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. Starting Tuesday, my new show, The Takeout with me, Major Garrett, makes its debut at this very same time slot. The Daily Report, that's coming up next, right here on CBS News 24/7.